Welcome to Caribbean Business Review, where insight meets impact. We bring you economic and financial updates, sharp statistical breakdowns, and data-driven insights on the forces shaping the region. Smart analysis, bold ideas, real Caribbean intelligence. This is CBR. Welcome to episode 6 of season 2 of the Caribbean Business Review. I'm Joseph Cox. First, let me extend my profound thanks to you for your support across all our social media channels and on MKR Radio. Our special guest this week is Dr. James Fletcher, CARICOM Climate Envoy and founder of the Caribbean Climate Justice Project, as we discuss the climate crisis in the Caribbean and ask this passionately: has the battle been lost? In the CBR briefing, we'll explore wage caps and fiscal balance and why Jamaica's Independent Fiscal Commission is advocating for the reintroduction of wage ceilings. But before we dive in, there's an issue we must raise. The renewed escalation in the U.S.-China trade tensions, marked by Washington's 100% tariffs on Chinese exports and Beijing's retaliatory port fees, signals a return to global trade fragmentation that could ripple through Caribbean economies. As small open markets deeply tied to U.S. demand and Chinese imports and global shipping routes, the region faces potential inflationary pressures and high import costs and freight charges. Exporters in logistics, bauxite, energy, and agriculture may lose competitiveness if global demand softens, while tourism-driven economies could contend with rising input costs. Yet amid the disruption, opportunities for nearshoring and re-export logistics may well emerge, but only if our policymakers move quickly to strengthen trade facilitation and supply chain resilience. Now, we'll be watching this particular story very closely, but for now, let's turn to the stories we are tracking on our Market Watch and Global Pulse segments. Coming up in the Market Watch, Jamaica's Independent Fiscal Commission has urged for the reintroduction of wage ceilings. Guyana to launch $200 million interest-free development bank by end 2026, and Cayman's home prices triple in a decade. Then in Global Pulse, U.S.-China trade tensions escalate as markets plummet, global freight rates fall up to 6.6%, and IMF sees global growth holding near 3%. All that and more this hour on Market Watch and Global Pulse. Coming up next is the CBR briefing. This is your CBR briefing. I'm Joseph Cox. In Jamaica's fiscal conversation, one issue has resurfaced: whether the government should reintroduce a public sector wage cap. The Independent Fiscal Commission warns that compensation now absorbs nearly half of tax revenues, up from 36% in 2021, crowding out capital projects, social programs, and debt reduction. The Commission argues that a fiscal rule for wages could restore predictability and discipline, protecting Jamaica's hard-won macro stability. But as policymakers weigh a new cap, the real question is how to contain wage pressures without triggering industrial contagion. History offers caution. From the 1970s to 2016, in Jamaica, repeated wage freezes flattened real incomes, eroded morale, and stifled domestic demand. Public sector pay lost so much value that skills professionals exited, weakening service delivery. And because government wages anchor private sector expectations, ceilings also compressed pay economy-wide, slowing productivity growth. Now, this is not just a Jamaican dilemma. Across the Caribbean, governments struggle to balance fiscal prudence and fairness. In Guyana, uneven adjustments have led to conditional cash transfers to offset wage disparities. St. Kitts and St. Lucia offer year-end bonuses instead of a systematic reform, while elsewhere public sector bargaining often becomes a substitute for inflation policy. The regional pattern is clear. Long-held caps depress real wages and growth. Sudden relaxations fuel inflation and wage spirals. It's a pendulum of restraint and relief, rarely achieving stability. In Jamaica, a new hard cap may simplify budgeting but risk all inefficiencies. Prioritizing essential groups like teachers, nurses, or security forces can spark pattern bargaining contagion, where every union demands parity, pushing costs higher and distorting the broader labor market. Over time, this entrenches wage compression, especially among mid-level professionals, even when productivity stalls. A better path is a rules-based framework, not a fixed ceiling, one that ties wage growth to productivity, inflation, and fiscal space, while completing all negotiations before the national budget as required by law. Built-in escape clauses would allow flexibility during shocks, and periodic reviews would ensure that compensation keeps pace with real value, not politics. The lesson for Jamaica and the wider region is that fiscal discipline must coexist with human capital preservation. Public servants aren't just a cost line, they are the machinery of growth and governance. A well-designed wage rule can protect the budget and preserve purchasing power. This is your 90-second market brief. The Caribbean continues to outperform Latin America with growth driven by tourism and energy exporters, but fiscal pressures remain high. The latest regional outlook points to solid expansion in Guyana, Grenada, and Barbados, though elevated debt and global uncertainty persist. Tourism momentum is strengthening. Sandals Resorts announced a $500 million beaches resort in St. Vincent, creating 2,000 jobs, while the CHTA warned that U.S. military activity in regional waters could unsettle visitor confidence. In Jamaica, the Independent Fiscal Commission urged reinstating a public sector wage cap to protect fiscal stability. The Kingston Freeport Terminal also expanded capacity with $20 million in new cranes, boosting logistics competitiveness. The Cayman Islands grew by 2.9%, though a new index shows home prices have tripled over the past decade. Bermuda finalizes a new beneficial ownership regime to meet FATF standards. Guyana plans a $200 million interest-free development bank, and a 54% jump in ship traffic since 2020 signals its growing role as a maritime hub. Meanwhile, St. Kitts and Nevis joined the Regional Agriculture Insurance Program, and Trinidad and Tobago's upcoming budget is seen as pivotal for diversification and growth. Now that's your market brief on Caribbean Business Review. For more, look for us on YouTube and Spotify.
In a world of constant change, insight is your greatest asset. At Joseph Cox & Associates, we empower innovation across the Caribbean. Whatever your challenge, we can help. We're proudly customer-centric, offering bespoke solutions tailored to every partner. From innovation and digital transformation to leadership and policy, our services are designed to deliver lasting impact. We partner with leaders across sectors, from finance and government to energy, tech, and infrastructure, helping them navigate complexity with confidence. Our work is grounded in collaboration. We connect regional leaders through powerful networks, driving change through joint research. Discover more at josephcox.org. Joseph Cox & Associates. Insight, experience, impact.
Still ahead on Caribbean Business Review, our conversation with Dr. James Fletcher, CARICOM Climate Envoy and founder of the Caribbean Climate Justice Project, as we discuss the climate crisis in the Caribbean.
And you're right, we're at the point now where we're no longer speculating about whether we will exceed 1.5. In fact, we exceeded 1.5 last year. So we're at the point where we have to now worry about how long will this overshoot last? Can we contain it to make it as small an overshoot as possible? And also, can we contain it to make it as short an overshoot as possible? Because if we can contain the magnitude and the duration, then we may be able to avoid some of the more catastrophic impacts.
Welcome back, everybody. This is the Caribbean Business Review. I'm Joseph Cox, and now we get into our strategy deep dive. And our special guest this week is Dr. James Fletcher. Now, I want to give my friend Jimmy Fletcher all his credits. So he is a CARICOM Climate Envoy. He's also the founder of the Caribbean Climate Justice Project. He's a former St. Lucia minister with responsibility for public service, sustainable development, energy science, and technology. He's also a lead as a champion for the REN 21, that's REN 21 Renewable Energy Champion. And of course, he's managing director of Solaricon. That is his business and his consultancy. And of course, to set the stage for our conversation today, he is, or was, I suppose, a central negotiator in ensuring this 1.5 degrees Celsius target in the Paris Agreement. And of course, as you hear me say that, you recognize that we're going to be having a conversation about climate change. And frankly speaking, Jimmy, as I welcome you to the program, the first question would, coming off of off the 1.5 degrees Celsius metric, the question is, with a significant likelihood that this target will be overshot, has our initiatives failed? How would you characterize what's going on?
Thanks, Joseph, and thanks for the invitation to be on your program. And I'm happy to be here today. It's a very good question. Certainly, our initiatives as small island developing states have not failed because, as you know, we're not the cause of this crisis. The cause of this crisis are the big industrialized countries. And if you look at the Caribbean as a whole, I think generates somewhere in the vicinity of 0.2 or less than 0.2% of total global greenhouse gas emissions. So even if tomorrow we were all to automatically become zero emitters, that we stop using fossil fuels for the generation of electricity, all of our cars were electric, and these electric cars were powered by solar, so wind, geothermal, water, and hydro. Wind, geothermal, solar, and you would only shave off 0.2% of global greenhouse gas emissions, which would not be enough to do anything, to be honest. It's good because it means that we will have the moral authority to speak with the kind of force that we speak in international arenas, and that's why we continue to take steps to reduce our emissions of greenhouse gases. And as you know, both of us having served on the board of CECRE, the Caribbean Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency, transitioning away from using fossil fuels makes good economic sense because we are all, mostly with the exception of Trinidad and Tobago, Suriname, and now Guyana, major importers of fossil fuels. So the cost of electricity in all of our countries is between 35 and 40 US cents per kilowatt hour. So it makes sense for us to transition away. But from a carbon footprint perspective, we are not causing any change in that needle where the global temperature is concerned. So our initiatives have not failed. We've done everything that we were supposed to do and we could have done, given the resources at our disposal. Who has failed us in all of this are the developed countries that agreed with the rest of the world, with the developing countries in 2015. I remember the date, the 12th of December 2015, at Le Bourget in Paris, when we gavelled the Paris Agreement, when we adopted it, and we committed to taking steps to contain the long-term temperature goal to 1.5 degrees Celsius. We said well below 2 degrees Celsius and pursuing efforts to get to 1.5. Now, why is 1.5 significant? It's significant because all of the science has shown, and not just science by developed countries, but science in developing countries, and even more so, science by our own climate studies group at Mona campus at the University of the West Indies. All of these studies have shown that 1.5 degrees Celsius is the absolute threshold for global warming for small island developing states like ours. Even before 1.5, you're already starting to see some of the catastrophic impacts of climate change. You're seeing more frequent droughts. You're seeing stronger hurricanes because the oceans have so much more heat, so much more energy to feed these hurricanes. You're seeing more frequent flooding. You're seeing flooding out of season. You're seeing impacts on health. You're seeing biodiversity being impacted. You see ecosystems on the verge of collapse. You're seeing species now starting to go extinct. There are things that we're seeing even before 1.5. But when we get to 1.5, we talk about massive dying back of coral. So massive coral bleaching. And as you know, our coral reefs are important to us for fisheries and for tourism. So 1.5 is the absolute guardrail for us. And you're right, we're at the point now where we're no longer speculating about whether we will exceed 1.5. In fact, we exceeded 1.5 last year. So we're at the point where we have to now worry about how long will this overshoot last? Can we contain it to make it as small an overshoot as possible? And also, can we contain it to make it as short an overshoot as possible? Because if we can contain the magnitude and the duration, then we may be able to avoid some of the more catastrophic impacts. But it's like, the analogy I like to use is like your body. You are running a fever. The longer you run that fever, the worse it gets for the organs of your body. So that's why when you start running a fever, the doctors will give you antibiotics or whatever else it takes to bring down that fever. They'll recommend that you take some cold baths, particularly if it's a child, to keep the temperature down, because you don't want that temperature to one, to get too high, and two, to last too long. It's the same thing on our planet. Our planet is running a fever, and the longer it runs that fever in that danger zone, the worse it gets for us. So it is a failure of the global systems within developed countries where we have not taken steps quickly enough to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases, where these developed countries have not decarbonized their economies quickly enough. So moving away from using fossil fuels to using renewable sources, they haven't done these things quickly enough. So we are where we are now. That we've seen that emissions have continued to rise, whereby now we should start seeing a leveling off. And it's not a good place for us as small island developing states.
But then, Jimmy, as you reflect on what happened, because as you know, our focus is primarily on how it impacts our business community. But when you reflect on what transpired with that Paris COP, right? That same Paris COP where you had the 1.5 degrees declaration, Article 8 in that same scenario, which treated the loss and damage. In that, you started to see that the commitment was just not there, frankly, because what you saw was places like the United States, the EU, and others basically saying, okay, fine, there is need for some sort of acknowledgement about loss and damage, but it must not include any liability for them. So in other words, they start to put the Chinese wall literally between themselves and any sponsorship of anything. And I'm therefore wondering, within that particular dynamic, how does one really, how are we supposed to view what is transpiring now? And do we need to change our messaging to actually be more reflective of what is obtaining right now? Because I take your point. If the 1.5, if the overshoot continues, the longer it continues, the greater the damage. But how should we really reconfigure our messaging? What do we need to do to really, or is there anything we can do to bring things at least somewhat back on track?
Yeah. Your reference to Article 8 is so on point, because I was in the middle of the loss and damage discussions. In fact, I was one of the ministerial leads for AOSIS, the Alliance of Small Island States, on loss and damage. And before we got to Paris, we were told by the developed countries that there is no way they would entertain loss and damage being a separate element in the Paris Agreement, because they did not want any claims of liability being attached to them, and any requirement for compensation to the countries, the developing countries that had been impacted. So what they did, as you pointed out, is that while we got Article 8 as a separate agreement, a separate element in the Paris Agreement, speaking about loss and damage, in the accompanying COP decision, there's a very famous or infamous paragraph 51 that says that nothing in Article 8 will open the door to liability and compensation. Now, this was a compromise we had to swallow, but we didn't mind so much. I'll tell you why. Because all of the legal minds told us then that there is nothing that can happen and nothing that can be placed in the Paris Agreement that can negate our rights under international law. So that even if the Paris Agreement says that Article 8, speaking about loss and damage, does not open the developed world to claims of liability and compensation, that we have a right under international law to make that claim. And you know what? This year, the International Court of Justice affirmed that position. It said that states have a legal responsibility to take action to reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases. They have to align it with the best available science. 1.5 degrees Celsius is the long-term temperature goal, not 2 degrees, 1.5. That countries have a responsibility to prevent transboundary harm. So it's not just what happens within your country, but if you, as a developed country, you are emitting greenhouse gases and you're doing things that are causing countries far away from your boundaries to experience harm, then that is, you are liable for that. And also, it spoke of things like intergenerational equity. That is not just this generation, but if you're doing things that will harm generations to come, then you are responsible for that. So I say all of that to say that right now we are not negotiating just within the ambit of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Paris Agreement and the strict four walls of those two agreements. We now have a legal basis to negotiate, or in fact to litigate, because it is saying that COP decisions of the Conference of the Parties, carry legal weight. So what we agreed to in Paris now has a legal standing. And I think that has to be our parallel track. So while the negotiations, the multilateral process, as important as it is, goes along its path and its slow path, and you'll understand why it's slow. You have 195 parties that are party to this convention. Some of them are major oil and gas producers. You don't expect a major oil and gas producer to agree with St. Kitts and Nevis or Palau or St. Lucia that it needs to decarbonize and reduce the emissions of greenhouse gas as quickly as possible. We are polar ends of this thing. So the multilateral process, Joseph, will take us so far. And to be honest, it has done well. And I say this not with any level of reservation. It has not done well enough, but it has done well because when we went into Paris, we were looking at the time with what had been done, we're looking at a long-term temperature increase of 4 degrees Celsius. I remember the World Bank putting out this publication called Turn Down the Heat, and it was very clear that we were headed for 4 degrees Celsius. Right now, we're headed for 2.7 degrees Celsius. So we're better off. But you see, the question is, do you want to drown now or do you want to drown in 50 years? Because that's the difference between 4 degrees Celsius and 2.7 degrees Celsius. It's when do you experience the worst impacts? You will still experience the worst impacts at 2.7. So it won't be, and you have to get to 2.7 before you get to 4. So we are not in a good place now. So that's why I think the International Court of Justice, the Inter-American Court on Human Rights, and the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea, those three advisory opinions have given us a legal basis where litigation can now start. So the same way, I'm sure you remember, back in the 1990s, when the tobacco industry in the US was famously saying that cigarette smoking was not causing cancer, was not causing harm. It was a choice you were making. So don't blame me if you got cancer. I never put a cigarette in your hand and lit it and told you have to smoke it. There was this Tobacco Master Settlement Agreement in 1998 that established liability and said to the tobacco industry, you are responsible and you have to take steps. And all of a sudden, all of the science that they had been denying, they had to turn back and say, okay, we'll put warning labels, we'll stop advertising to children. Right. I think these advisory opinions, Joseph, do the same thing. They now give us a legal basis to challenge in court what the major polluters have been doing, which is denying the science and pretending as if they have no legal responsibility and no liability for what is happening. So while people like myself continue to go to Conference of the Parties and negotiate, sometimes very frustratingly, because we're not getting the types of results that we're seeing. We are seeing incremental progress when climate change impacts are exploding all around us. There is an avenue now, particularly for civil society, to say, look, we have these advisory opinions. Let us test it in court and let's see whether we can make these guys pay for what they're doing.
All right. Now, I hear you on that, but then we'll argue it from the perspective of our business. The truth of it is that despite what you're saying, that would be cold comfort. And I'll tell you why I'm saying that. It would be cold comfort to a business to establish their entity in any of these vulnerable islands as it stands now, because, for example, United States, one of the major emitters and one of the chief deniers nowadays, they do not recognize. They have not ratified the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. They have not ratified that, and they basically very selectively acknowledge the rulings of the ICC. CJ, sorry. So I mean, I don't know that this is binding. I mean, yes, it sounds good, and in some degrees, I suppose we have to acknowledge it at the very least as a palliative. But I don't know how binding this will be, even over the medium term, on any of these major emitters, given the stance that they have taken.
But they operate in countries other than the United States, and that's where I
True.
think so. Whilst they may be protected within the US, and even that we have to test legally, they operate within countries that recognize the Inter-American Court on Human Rights, recognize the rulings of the ICJ, and maybe that might be the soft point. Maybe that might be where we tackle them and say, okay, we might not get any comfort within the United States, within the court system in the United States, but we could probably get comfort in the court system in some other country where you're operating. But going back to your point about business, and I know that's your focus. I think it means now that business has to approach this whole issue of climate and climate risk very differently to the way it's approaching it right now, because I'm not sure, and some of that is our fault as government and as negotiators. We've just concluded 1 week of pre-COP negotiations in St. Lucia. Tuesday and Wednesday, we had meetings of the negotiators where we came together to look at what our negotiating positions, what are the things that are unresolved, and where we should, what we should address, and where are our red lines. So the things that the lines that we will definitely not cross and where we will not compromise. That was followed by a meeting of ministers of the environment. And today we had the first meeting of the Prime Ministerial Subcommittee on Climate Change and Climate Action. And the point that I've made to our negotiators repeatedly is that we have to be a lot more forceful in what we do, how we do it, and the decisions that we take. And they refer to us, Joseph, as the canary in the coal mine. So we're the first ones. If that air quality is going bad, we're the first ones that'll feel it. The problem is that canary has died how many times and had to be resuscitated, and we can't continue to accept that. But the original point I was making is for the business community. They now have to start doing their own risk assessment. You have to look at where are you exposed, and also a big thing for the business community now is this whole question of insurance risk premiums. Because with climate change now causing more extreme weather events, particularly things like flooding and hurricanes and everything, a big part of our economy in the Caribbean is tourism. It is getting more and more expensive and more difficult to insure assets, because these assets are now very vulnerable to extreme weather events. And it's not just an asset located in a coastal area. It's an asset located anywhere. So businesses now have to do risk assessments. Banks have to do risk assessments. So somebody comes to them and wants to set up an enterprise, anything from agriculture to tourism. Every single sector is vulnerable to climate change. So it now changes. Your whole risk profile changes. How you are exposed is changed dramatically, and how you can insure yourself to mitigate those risks also is changed dramatically. So climate risk assessment has to be an important component of the work of the operations of any business in the Caribbean. And they also have to take steps to ensure that they mitigate those risks, not just with insurance, but if there are things they can do. So you're talking about one of the areas in which climate change will impact us very severely is water. We'll be seeing a lot of variability in the water supply. When we should be seeing, we'll get flooding. We have serious flooding in St. Lucia today from a weather system that has passed through. Prime Minister Gaston Brown was on the line with the Prime Ministerial Subcommittee meeting today, and he said they've seen, I think he said it was 6 or 8 inches of rainfall in Antigua in a 6-hour period. That's significant. That's massive. So, as a business, you now have to start preparing what used to be a 1 in 50 year or 1 in a 100 year event.
No, once every 2
1 in
years.
5 year, 1 in 10 year event. How does that affect your risk profile? How does that affect your business? If you're a bank and you're giving out a loan, how does that affect the ability of that person to repay that loan? So it's not just negotiations, and boy, it's also the impact it is having on us economically in our region, that our businesses that are already fragile, and you know that better than most people, now have additional fragility layered onto them because of climate change.
No, indeed, I take your point extremely well, and this is part of the challenge that I'm having, because it seems to me that what we also need to do is be more direct in terms of our messaging. So, for example, Georgetown, Guyana. Guyana is what, 6 feet below, well, Georgetown is 6 feet below sea level. There are clear implications for that. People would be, the tourist minded, etc., they would have heard of the Maldives. If the sea levels continue to rise, the Maldives will no longer exist. You look in Jamaica, you see half of the Hellshire Beach, or what we used to know as Hellshire Beach, it's back out in the sea. So in other words, yes. So these are some of the practical things that I'm looking at. But then when you counterbalance it, because obviously we cannot throw up our hands, we relocate islands, right? But at the same time, given where we are with insurance, given where we are with the cost of building materials, given where we are in terms of labor shortages, etc., one wonders what, from your standpoint, what would represent a viable path forward? Because we can't ignore the fact that, well, United States seem to go through schizophrenia, frankly, because they deny climate change, but at the same time, I looked at some data just today whereby the share of renewables in the United States are actually increasing. Contrary to the rhetoric. This increases. I don't know what to make of it.
Because Joseph, as much as the United States, so and it's not so much the United States, it's the federal government. So as much as the federal government would like to send a signal that it is anti-renewables, particularly anti-wind, the president seems to have a serious pet peeve where wind is concerned and wind turbines are concerned, that is anti-wind. But there's a global momentum that the United States cannot stop. It cannot push back. I mean, we're seeing now more deployment of renewable energy than deployment of coal. The cost of solar energy, solar photovoltaic, plus battery energy storage systems right now is competitive with the most competitive fossil fuel, which is natural gas. And a lot of the studies that we've seen suggest that in 2 years' time, that solar plus battery energy storage systems, as the price of panels goes down, as the price of batteries goes down, that it will be more competitive than natural gas. So if you're looking to start a business and that business is energy intensive, what will you do? You will go to the least cost fuel. And if the least cost fuel is renewable energy, it doesn't matter what the president says. When you have to face the bank to repay your loan, it's not the president paying your loan. It's you have to now ensure that you have sufficient latitude in your financial operations to be able to repay your loan. And if you will get that extra buffer from using renewables, that's what you'll do. And that's precisely what is happening. But it speaks to a bigger point, and that is, and that's the one you've been alluding to, and I had not answered, and that's messaging. How do we cause that message to get across? And unfortunately, scientists are not good communicators. I will tell you this, and I say it without reservation. I'm a scientist. I did my first degree and my PhD were both in scientific subjects. And if I'd remained a scientist all my life, I would not be a good communicator, because scientists really are not taught to communicate. At least not communicate to the average person. So a scientist talking to a scientist, they get along very, very well. They understand what each other say. I was in Austria last week in Vienna for a meeting of the International Institute of Applied Systems Analysis. So 180 scientists came together to discuss overshoot. And I said to them, you were talking, and yes, I'm a scientist and I understood everything you were saying because you're speaking to each other. But the average person coming in here, their eyes would glaze over after the first 2 or 3 minutes because they wouldn't understand a word of what you're saying. But these are precisely the people we need to communicate to. These are people we need to get to understand the implications of climate change, what they can do to reduce their risk, and what they can do or how they should be advocating to governments to change behaviors. So that is part of the problem. We have not been able to communicate the gravity of the situation and what needs to be done to the people who matter. And that is civil society, that is the business community, that is the financial sector, The only people who get it are the young people, because they're seeing the impacts and they're understanding that, oh gosh, boy, 10, 15, 20 years from now, the country that I'm living in will be a drastically different country. You're right, Marshall Islands, Kiribati, Vanuatu, Fiji, all of these islands
Tuvalu,
will
right?
disappear. Tuvalu, they will disappear
Yeah.
at the current rate we're going. So it's not like Jamaica or St. Lucia where you could retreat. So if you're living on the coast in Jamaica or you're living on the coast in St. Lucia, you could retreat inland. It might be a little bit more crowded, but you can retreat. These people have nowhere to retreat to. So what's going to happen to them? You can't rent an island, but you'll have to find space on some other island for them to live. And so these are some of the things that we have to get across to people. And that this is not a future reality. We're not talking the year 2500 where, we talking about something that might happen in the next 25, 30, mostly by the end of this century for sure. So our communication has to change, and we have to get everyone. This climate change has been, up until now, a government thing, where negotiators and governments are the ones involved. But this has to be a whole of society thing. This has to be where everybody understands what is at stake and everybody takes action as best they can and puts pressure wherever they can.
No, point well taken. But then as we move along and really coming towards the end of our conversation, the question is, in terms of the global financial architecture, how responsive has that been, and to what extent do we need fundamental reforms? I'm talking rhetoric now. I'm talking fundamental reform to the process so we can actually facilitate the kind of transformation to mitigate against what is almost an imperative certainty right now.
Yeah. No, that is the crux of the problem, because you have two things. You have the impact and then you have the response. So the impact is being caused by temperatures that are increasing because of greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide. So the response has to be, how do we adapt? Now, we don't have the means to adapt. All of our countries are carrying debt to GDP ratios above prudential limits, not because, and I repeat, not because our governments have been irresponsible, but because our governments have had to borrow money every time there's an extreme weather event. I'm not talking about extreme weather events, the type of which make headlines on CNN or ABC.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, you'll hear about the Hurricane Marias and the Hurricane Irmas, but they're also tropical storms. They're weather systems that pass through. The weather system that passed through St. Lucia today and Antigua has caused flooding that is causing significant infrastructure loss. Abandonment and loss of farms and livelihoods by farmers. So every time these things happen, and it doesn't matter how much the international community pitches in, they never give the governments enough money to pay for all of the damage that was. When Hurricane Maria went through Dominica, it caused losses and damage equivalent to 226% of that country's GDP. So that's 2 years worth of productive output that was wiped out in the space of
A couple
few
hours.
hours. Yeah, a few hours. So how do you recover from that? So, but yet we are told that our debt to GDP ratios are too high, and that now reduces our fiscal space to be able to maneuver. But we're also told that many of us are graduating, and that we're no longer low-income countries. We're now high middle-income countries because our GDPs are climbing, and our GDPs are climbing even with serious inequalities in our system, in our economy. So it's not like everybody, like a rising tide that is raising all boats. No, some are doing well, but you still have serious levels of inequality, but you have improvement in GDP. So your GDP per capita has now brought you as a country to a point now where you no longer qualify for grant and concessional financing. So you have to go now borrow money. And the other thing is that whilst they tell you that we were supposed to get $100 billion US annually from 2020, we've never come close, and that's for climate. That's to help us respond to climate change. We've never got anywhere near that money. Then last year in Baku, it was raised to $300 billion annually. Now, the $300 billion, it sounds like a lot. But Joseph, the requirement for adaptation finance in developing countries right now is around $400 billion a year. The requirement for loss and damage is in the vicinity of almost $400 billion a year. There's a fund for responding to loss and damage. You know how much money it has in it? $788 million, when the annual
All right.
requirement is $400 billion. And then what they say to us is that no, but it won't just be public finance. We can't only depend on public finance. There's also going to be private finance in there. But you know what private finance is? Private finance is money that you have to borrow. So,
Of course.
and I used that analogy 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago in New York during New York Climate Week. I said, you know what you guys are doing? And I said, I'm in the US, so I'm going to use an analogy that you understand. That is like you taking a baseball bat and breaking both of my knees and saying to me that the surgery that I will need to put my leg straight again, I have to borrow the money from you to pay for that surgery. Then the cast I will need to immobilize my leg so that I don't damage it whilst I'm recovering, I will have to borrow money from you to do that. And the crutches I will need when I'm able to hobble around, I have to borrow money from you for those crutches. So you're breaking my leg, and every
Yes.
part of my recovery is dependent on you lending me money, and sometimes not at concessional rates. I said there's no justice in that. So when you tell me that you're making private finance available to me, so what? For a country that is experiencing sea level rise to build coastal defenses to respond to a problem it did not cause, or a country that is experiencing significant water shortage to now have to go and borrow money to put in water infrastructure to deal with a problem it did not cause, that can't be fair. So you're right, the entire international financial architecture has to change and has to understand that you cannot victimize developing countries, climate vulnerable countries, over and over again with a system that is not working. The multilateral development banks, it's even pulling teeth to get them to understand that if a hurricane passes like Maria did in Dominica and causes 226% damage, that you have to now readjust interest payments and loan repayments to give that country some breathing space until it gets back on its feet again. I think you should wipe out the debt, but okay, if you don't want to wipe out the debt, give the country a moratorium on loan repayments so that it can fight. Even getting them to do that, to put those clauses in the loans, has been something we have to fight hard to get. So can you imagine? So yes, the short answer to your question, sorry for being so long-winded about it, is yes.
No, man, no problem.
You need radical reform of the international financial architecture. The instruments that were set up, like the Green Climate Fund and the Global Environment Facility and the Adaptation Fund, one, they're insufficiently capitalized, but the amount of documentation you have to go through to produce a report, to produce a proposal that can find its way to their board, Joseph, is beyond the capacity of many of these small island developing states, but we have to do it because that's how we get the fund. You know how much time, the gestation period is for any one of these countries to get a project from conceptualization to being put in front of the GCF board where it is GCF ready? We're talking years, so that by the time it gets to that point, the problem that you're trying to solve has blown up in magnitude, maybe 2 or 3 times. So the money you're asking for is now inadequate for the problem that is now in front of you.
Point well taken, my friend. Point well taken. All right, in 30 seconds, because all I have time left for. In 30 seconds, is COP the right venue? No? Or has it outlived its thing? Should we look into broader things like UN or some other fora? Is COP still viable?
It is still viable. It is, but what we should not look at COP is as the only venue, because COP is where you have all of the countries in the world coming together and agreeing on action that needs to be taken for climate. So it is the one place where multilateralism in the climate ecosystem is alive. I won't tell you it works very well, but it works. So we do make incremental progress. There are things that we have made progress on. So yes, but we should not put all of our eggs in the COP basket. We have to look at other areas where bilaterals. So if we can see what we can get from the UK, from the EU, from those countries that are more receptive. Australia wants to host COP next year. So we have to say to Australia, okay, and you're pitching this as an Australian Pacific SIDS COP, then if it is, then what will we get out of this as a small island developing state region? So I think this, and you also mentioned the GA, but we know the GA, just how politically difficult it is to deal with a global architecture that still gives veto power to a few countries at the Security Council. And unfortunately, within the United Nations system, although all countries are created equal, some countries are more equal than others. We can't deny that.
Classic Animal Farm.
Yes.
Jimmy Fletcher, thank you so much. Dr. James Fletcher, he is a CARICOM Climate Envoy. He's founder of the Caribbean Climate Justice Project, former St. Lucia Minister of Government, Renewable Energy Champion and the REN 21 program, and of course, Managing Director of Solaricon. Jimmy, thank you so much for your time. It's always a pleasure. And I do hope that we'll be able to continue this dialogue from time to time, because I think this is so important as we go forward in terms of planning, business strategy, and how we develop as we go forward. So thank you very much, my friend.
My pleasure, Joseph. Thanks for having me.
In a world of constant change, insight is your greatest asset. At Joseph Cox and Associates, we empower innovation across the Caribbean. Whatever your challenge, we can help. We're proudly customer-centric, offering bespoke solutions tailored to every partner. From innovation and digital transformation to leadership and policy, our services are designed to deliver lasting impact. We partner with leaders across sectors, from finance and government to energy, tech, and infrastructure, helping them navigate complexity with confidence. Our work is grounded in collaboration. We connect regional leaders through powerful networks, driving change through joint research. Discover more at josephcox.org. Joseph Cox and Associates. Insight, experience, impact.
Welcome to Market Watch. I'm Joseph Cox, bringing you the latest economic and financial updates across the Caribbean and beyond. The Fall 25 Latin America and Caribbean Economic Review projects 2.3% regional growth next year, with the Caribbean again outpacing Latin America. Guyana leads at 11.8%, followed by Grenada, St. Vincent and Barbados between 3 and 4%, while Trinidad and Tobago grows 1.4%. Inflation has eased sharply and debt ratios are improving in Jamaica, Barbados, and Belize, but the report warns high global rates and softer demand from China and G7 markets are squeezing policy space. In tourism and investment, Sandals Resorts International has announced a $185 million beaches resort in St. Vincent, creating 2,000 jobs and expanding regional training. But the CHTA cautions that U.S. military operations in nearby waters could dampen arrivals and threaten the region's image as a zone of peace. Turning to finance, the Central Bank of the Bahamas has opened consultations on major legislative reforms, strengthening depositor protection, modernizing payment systems, and integrating digital currency oversight. Financial Secretary Simon Wilson says the focus now is on boosting productivity and bringing public debt down to 50% of GDP by 2030. In the Cayman Islands, GDP grew 2.9% in Q1. Inflation ticked up to 1.9%, while a new property index shows home prices up 186% since 2015. Over to our country updates. In Bermuda, a new Beneficial Ownership Act takes effect in November, expanding transparency under FATF standards. In Barbados, the trade deficit widened to $2.47 billion as imports rose 6% and exports fell 12%. In Guyana, government is to launch a $200 million interest-free development bank by 2026. Ship traffic has risen 54% since 2020 as port upgrades advance. Since St. Kitts and Nevis joined the Regional Agri-Insurance Program, REAP, offering government-funded climate risk coverage for farmers and fishers. Jamaica's debt fell to 62% of GDP, though the Independent Fiscal Commission warns rising wages could crowd out investment and urges the reintroduction of wage caps. Suriname, working with the Deutsche Bank on the world's first ITMO carbon trade deal to monetize forest protection. In Trinidad and Tobago, business groups call the October 13 budget pivotal, urging diversification beyond energy. And BVI is seeking a UK debt limit waiver to fund airport expansion and tourism growth. Before we close, let's take a quick look at the region's currency and stock market movements. On the foreign exchange front, most CARICOM currencies were stable. The Jamaican dollar traded at 161.62, the Trinidad and Tobago dollar at $6.80, and the Barbados dollar held firm at $2.03 to the U.S. The OECS dollar remained pegged at 271 per U.S., while the Ghana dollar hovered near 218 to 1. In regional equities, the JSC index edged 0.09% higher, closing at 322,286. Trinidad's all TNT index slipped 0.21%, while the Barbados and Bahamas exchanges were flat. The Bermuda Stock Exchange added 0.1%, and the Eastern Caribbean Securities Exchange rose 0.08%, reflecting mild regional optimism. Top gainers included A.S. Bread and Sons up 9.3% and West Indies Tobacco up 7.9%. Top decliners included Palace Amusement down 16.8% and Key Insurance off 16.4%. Well, that's it for this edition of Market Watch. I'm Joseph Cox. Global Pulse is up next. This is CBR. This is Global Pulse, connecting the trends shaping economies and markets worldwide. I'm Joseph Cox. We begin with the U.S.-China trade war, which has reignited after months of uneasy truce. President Donald Trump announced 100% tariffs on Chinese exports and new export controls on critical software following Beijing's decision to expand export restrictions on rare earth minerals. China will also impose new port fees on U.S.-owned, operated, or built vessels the same day Washington's fees on China's linked ships take effect. The tit-for-tat measures could cost the world's top carriers billions and disrupt key shipping lanes, sending freight and insurance costs sharply higher. Analysts warn the renewed confrontation between the world's two largest economies risks fragmenting global trade, tightening supply chains, and reigniting inflation pressures worldwide. Turning to the financial system, the IMF is warning of rising risks to the $9.6 trillion global foreign exchange market. In its latest Global Financial Stability Report, the IMF urged major players to strengthen liquidity buffers, build capital reserves, and expand stress testing to contain contagion from funding shocks. In the energy sector, OPEC Plus has agreed to raise output modestly by 137,000 barrels per day in November. Oil prices remain near 4-month lows even as China accelerates its oil stockpiling program, adding 169 million barrels of new reserve capacity through 2026. Meanwhile, in the United States, the Energy Information Administration projects electricity demand will surge to a record 4.3 trillion kilowatt hours by 2026, driven by AI data centers and the electrification of transport and heating. Renewables will climb to 26% of generation, while natural gas gradually declines, marking a critical pivot in the U.S. energy transition. Turning to global updates, in the United Kingdom, regulators expect £8 to £10 billion in compensation for unfair car loans between 2007 and 2024 in one of Britain's largest financial redress schemes. In Canada, the trade deficit widened to $6.3 billion in August. In Germany, industrial production plunged 4.3% in August, even as Berlin rolled out a €500 billion stimulus to revive growth. In the European Union, Brussels unveiled a €1 billion Apply AI plan to accelerate industrial AI adoption and reduce dependence on US tech. In Japan, household spending rose 2.3% in August. On the global trade front, the WTO raised its 2025 global trade forecast to 2.4%, driven by strong AI-related exports, but warned growth could slow in 2026 amid new protectionist barriers. In the markets, oil prices tumbled sharply this week as trade tensions weighed on demand forecasts. WTI crude fell 4.2% to $58.90, while Brent dropped nearly 5% to $62.02. The OPEC basket bucked the trend, edging 0.9% higher to $67.09. But natural gas slumped almost 5% to US $3.10. Global equities also turned low. The Dow Jones Industrial Average slid 1.9%, the S&P 500 lost 2.7%, and the Nasdaq plunged 3.6%. Losses extended across Europe and Asia, with Germany's DAX off 1.5%, Japan's Nikkei down 1%, and Hong Kong's Hang Seng retreating 1.7%. The synchronized sell-off underscores investor unease over global trade disruption and slowing growth. Now that's Global Pulse. I'm Joseph Cox. This is CBR. Well, that's a wrap on episode 6 of season 2 of the Caribbean Business Review. Thank you to our loyal audience across all our platforms and NKR Radio. We appreciate your continued support as we live by our mantra that knowledge is strength, but information is power. A special thanks to our guest this week, Dr. James Fletcher, CARICOM Climate Envoy and founder of the Caribbean Climate Justice Project, for his unvarnished insights on the climate crisis in the Caribbean. Now, here are some of the key takeaways. In terms of accountability and justice, small island states are not the cause of the climate crisis, yet face its gravest risks. The 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold is non-negotiable, and developed nations must decarbonize faster while reforming global finance to deliver true climate justice. In terms of resilience and risk, Caribbean governments and businesses must embed climate risk assessments and adapt financing models to protect economies and communities from intensifying climate impacts. And in terms of actions on communication, confronting climate change requires a whole-of-society effort, stronger communication, broader alliances beyond COP, and unified advocacy to convey the urgency of the crisis. Now remember that you can catch this program on Spotify, and the latest edition of the Caribbean Financial Dispatch newsletter is now live on LinkedIn, WhatsApp, and linked in the YouTube comments. As always, we invite you to like, share, and subscribe to this broadcast, and follow Caribbean Business Review on TikTok, Spotify, YouTube, Instagram, X, and LinkedIn. Until next week, same time, same place, I am Joseph Cox, and this has been CBR.